The French president raises eyebrows by describing NATO as brain dead. Is the alliance weakening? Can Europe create an alternative? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. NATO is experiencing brain death. So says French President Emmanuel Macron. Many of his European partners in the alliance certainly don't agree, though. They call his words drastic and dangerous. In an interview with the Economist magazine, the French president blamed the US, saying its commitment to NATO is weakening. Macron cited the US failure to consult it before pulling its forces out of northern Syria. He also questioned whether the alliance is still committed to collective defense. And he called on Europe to think of itself as a geopolitical power and ensure it's in control of its destiny. Macron's remarks come ahead of a summit in the UK early next month to mark NATO's 70th anniversary. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says NATO must change or risk irrelevance.
NATO runs always the risk that it will become obsolete, not because the partnership, not because the political commitments will ever become. I don't think in the transatlantic, those commitments between our countries will ever become obsolete. But it does run that risk if it doesn't do the things it needs to do to confront the challenges of today in a way that is effective.
Well, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel rejected what she called Macron's drastic words. Germany's foreign minister is warning against undermining NATO. In a column in Der Spiegel magazine, he said, neither Germany nor Europe will be able to effectively protect themselves without the US. And in an interview with the Financial Times, Poland's Prime Minister viewed Macron's questioning of NATO's commitment to mutual defense as dangerous. The Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Jens Stoltenberg, on the other hand, stressed the coalition was strong and the US and Europe are working closer together than in the past decades. Incoming European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen hailed NATO as a protective shield of freedom and said the most powerful defense alliance in the world. Well, for more on this now, I'm joined by our guests. We have in Brussels John Lockland, author and consultant on international law. John is also a lecturer at the University Institute of St. Pius X. On Skype from Philadelphia, Alexander Vershbow, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO and the former US Ambassador to NATO and Russia. And in Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, defense and military analyst and columnist for Novaya Gazeta. A warm welcome to everyone. Let's start with John then. Is NATO dying?
Well, I think Emmanuel Macron's remark that it was brain dead is not exactly hot news. I mean, NATO has been brain dead, I would say, since 1991, when the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. It was, of course, created, as we all know, to supposedly face down the Soviet threat. But when that threat disappeared, logically, NATO should have been dissolved as well. Instead of which, for reasons of institutional self-interest, and above all for reasons of geopolitical self-interest, and when I refer to that, I'm talking about the United States of America, in complicity, of course, with its European allies. But we see from Emmanuel Macron's remark and from the reactions to it that the truth is that NATO is simply an instrument for American geopolitical
if I could jump in here,
expansionism.
The counter-argument to that would be, I'm sure, by NATO and its supporters that, hey, we've seen Russia make moves in Crimea. You know, there are plenty of reasons why NATO is still relevant and not brain dead.
Yes, but you can't simply start the story in Crimea in 2014. This came 20 years after relentless, remorseless Western geopolitical expansionism, which included the attack on Yugoslavia in 1999, the Orange Revolution in 2004, obviously the Iraq War of 2003. So whether or not these things were involved with NATO or whether NATO itself was officially involved, there has been an immense pushback, and it just so happened that the reaction finally came became in
in again.
2014.
There are those who would say, let's not forget NATO's intervention in Yugoslavia because a genocide was being committed in the ex-Yugoslavia.
A genocide was not being committed in Yugoslavia.
Was committed.
That was war propaganda, which has been proved false since. There was never any genocide committed in Kosovo. Indeed, nobody in Kosovo was even accused of genocide. So I'm sorry, that was just war propaganda. It was about, the
ICJ rulings that talk about...
There weren't...
Srebrenica
that was in Bosnia. That was not in Kosovo.
That is ex-Yugoslavia. I never said
excuse
Kosovo.
Excuse me, Srebrenica is in Bosnia.
Bosnia
it's not
is an ex-Yugoslavia state,
We're
isn't
talking
it, John?
about
I'm
the
sure
attack
you know your
on
geography.
on Yugoslavia in 1999.
Bosnia is one of the
Kosovo.
ex-Yugoslav states, though. And you just said the attack on Yugoslavia.
It's got nothing to do with the 1999 war. I'm sorry, you are confusing two separate things which were 4 years apart in time. You cannot deny that there has been
No, I'm sorry, Bosnia is part of the ex-Yugoslavia, and you just said that NATO carried out a raid on ex-Yugoslavia. My question is, should we not keep in the context the horrible massacres which ICJ rulings have upheld that were committed in Yugoslavia and see NATO's action in that context?
I'm sorry, I don't think you know what you're talking about when you ask that question. Srebrenica occurred in 1995. Things had calmed down. 4 years later, a civil war started in Kosovo, and Yugoslavia was attacked
I'm sorry, I
by
think
NATO
you're actually confusing.
in 1999.
You're
this is
confusing
just one
Kosovo.
example
I haven't said anything
of a
about
series of
Kosovo.
attacks
You've
that NATO
brought
and
Kosovo
its allies
into
have
this.
committed.
I'm afraid you're confusing Kosovo. I have not brought Kosovo into this discussion. Anyway, let's move on. I think I've made the point is that many would say NATO was a vital instrument.
I began talking about the attack in 1999, which was the attack over Kosovo.
Which you mentioned. Let's bring in Alexander if we can. What do you make of this? Is NATO's role really irrelevant, or is it a vital instrument that has been used since the end of the Cold War, whether it's in Yugoslavia or in other places, for a useful purpose?
Yeah, well, I don't want to get into relitigating the past. I'm a strong believer in NATO, and I think NATO's adaptation after the end of the Cold War was extremely important for increasing security, stability, and spreading democracy and free market reforms across the formerly satellite countries of Eastern Europe. Has NATO solved all of our problems? No. There are still challenges facing the alliance today, and Emmanuel Macron has raised some legitimate issues that people were sometimes afraid to speak out loud. And it's kind of a paradox. NATO has continued to strengthen itself in terms of rebuilding deterrence and defense since the Russian aggression against Ukraine 5 years ago. A lot of the good things that have happened in NATO...
Let me jump in here if I could as well, and let me also speak, as I think maybe from John's perspective, is that really the role that NATO has played since the end of the Cold War hasn't been the role that it was initially created for. It may be one thing to push back against Serbian nationalism as it, manifested itself in the ex-Yugoslavia, but NATO was created to counter the threat of the Soviet Union.
That's right, and NATO decided in 1991 that it should adapt itself rather than go out of business, and I think that was the right decision. Ending genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where we saw for the first time since World War II concentration camps and ethnic cleansing. And I would defend what NATO did in Kosovo and dealing with war crimes which were documented by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And it adapted again after 9/11 and became part of the world's response to international terrorism. Let's focus on what NATO needs to do now in this discussion. It does need to adapt again. Europe does need to play a bigger role in NATO. Donald Trump isn't totally wrong when he hammers the allies over defense spending. But at the same time, the U.S. needs to rebuild its own leadership role. And that's what Macron was, I think, calling attention to when he said NATO was brain dead. He was basically saying U.S. leadership, which is the sort of essential foundation for NATO, can no longer be relied upon based on what we've seen Trump do in northern Syria, but also some of the statements he's made over the last few years calling into question whether the United States would be there if an ally fell under attack. So The bigger question is, what are we going to do about it? There, the French don't have any great answers as to how to remedy the erosion of U.S. leadership within NATO.
Let's bring in Pavel then. From Russia's perspective, Pavel, we've seen pretty positive comments on official tweets after we heard the comments from Macron, the French president, calling that a golden comment. Do you think, does Russia see that any sort of admission of the irrelevance of NATO, any crumbling or weakening of NATO, is a gain for Russia?
Well, NATO is seen as Moscow as a kind of eternal boogeyman. I mean, the concentration of anti-Russian sentiment and anti-Russian military power, the threat, and of course any kind of internal tensions and disagreements and inside NATO and the weakening of the transatlantic link between Washington and the European allies is always welcome. But there's also a kind of underlining to that if indeed NATO begins to crumble, that would not be good news for a lot of people in Moscow, to the military, to the intelligence community, defense industry, I mean, those who are called siloviki in Russia, because they have been using a NATO threat as a very important argument for bargaining for more money from the budget, increasing their role for internal propaganda and for internal intergovernmental discussions with the more liberal economic bloc of the government.
Right, but Pavel, that might be the
sentiment
sentiment within some of the military industry within Russia, but from perhaps a more national perspective, a sort of national geopolitical perspective, is it mistaken to say that Putin is probably happy to see the sorts of voices being raised within NATO that say this organization may be irrelevant now?
Well, most likely, yes, but Putin has given, I don't know, daily briefings about the growing NATO threat at the same time by his intelligence people and the military, who are saying that NATO is very strong and creating new threats and new military units and threats appearing all the time. So it's a kind of double picture. And of course, it's not the first time that the French undermined NATO. Under President General Charles de Gaulle, they took France out of NATO, kicked NATO headquarters out of France and American bases out of France, and this was very welcome in Moscow at the time in the 60s. But, well, NATO didn't disappear. NATO has been in eternal different kind of types of crisis for a lot of time, as the European Union is. I mean, such an organization of so many states, there's all the time internal tensions. But it's not going away anytime soon, and that's maybe good for the siloviki in Moscow, too.
John, even if NATO is irrelevant, even if, as you said, it should have died with the end of the Cold War, is not the reality that Europe would form another kind of common defense mechanism?
Well, I think, yes, exactly. I think Macron may have asked some good questions, but I think he's given the wrong answers. I think he's asked a good question because, as I said earlier, he has identified the fact, both he and the people who've responded to him, that in reality NATO is nothing but a vector or a vehicle for American power. It's not in that sense an alliance. It's simply one in a long series in human history of hegemonic arrangements whereby one country dominates a whole series of others. And those other countries may decide that they have an interest in joining this hegemonic alliance and in being protected by the hegemon. That is, in some cases, a rational calculation. But nonetheless, that is the reality. The reason why I think Macron is giving the wrong answer to a good question is that he says that NATO is dead now because of American and Turkish unilateralism and because Turkey and Trump are not playing the game. But by definition, any kind of permanent alliance is always going to be victim to the same danger. There would be exactly the same danger of the free rider, which Macron identified, and of divergent policy choices, which he also identified, within a European alliance. So politically speaking, and above all militarily, because the sheer weight of American power is so gigantic in comparison to the ultimately insignificant European power, that, yes, there could be a European alliance, but it would not reflect
hang on, John. Are you
anything
saying
like the
then
realities that NATO
really,
currently has.
There is really no need for any sort of common defence mechanism in Europe, whether it's including the US or even without the US?
I don't believe in permanent alliances. I think that countries have to take care of their own security above all. Of course, they can engage in temporary arrangements, but I think the danger of permanent alliances, the dangers are those ones that Macron has identified. And because NATO as an institution has been looking for a role ever since the disappearance of the Soviet threat, it has not, and this is where I disagree with Ambassador Vershbow, it has not been a factor of security. It has been a factor of insecurity. Its actions in the Balkans have created insecurity. Its attack on Libya in 2011 created insecurity. It unleashed a wave of migration across the Mediterranean because of the anarchy that was unleashed in Libya. And Europeans are the ones paying the price for the blowback from these operations, which were ultimately backed, if not in most cases initiated, by the Americans. So this is the fundamental dysfunctionality of NATO.
All right, let me bring in Alexander. I think you might have a slightly different perspective, having been a US ambassador. Let me get you to answer to some of the points that John's raising there. Basically, NATO represents a hegemony of US interests over Europe, and that Europe really could do without that.
Well, I disagree with about 99% of what John has said. Yes, the U.S. is the strongest member of NATO, and that's actually an unstable factor. The U.S. is providing a disproportionately large share of the capabilities. Europe does need to punch at a higher level if NATO is going to have a future. But the idea that it's a vehicle for U.S. hegemony is similar to what you hear in the crudest form of propaganda from Russia today. I served as U.S. ambassador to NATO, and yes, people listen very carefully to what the American ambassador has to say, but it is a genuine alliance where there's give and take and compromises, and all decisions are taken by consensus.
In a strange way, Alexander, if I could jump in
a
here.
hegemonic alliance.
I mean, if you follow the logic of some of the tweets by the current US president, you might be led to think that maybe he wants to see Europe carry its own military responsibilities without the US having to shoulder at least part of that.
No, I think that's what President Trump has been saying, and he's not entirely wrong. If you want to have an alliance that lasts, that is seen as in the interest of all of its members, then the burdens have to be shared more equitably. But what Macron has suggested is kind of that Europe should go on its own. And while that might sound nice,
do you think Europe can, Alexander?
Not today. If the U.S. were to pull out or pull back substantially from its commitments to NATO, Europe would be woefully short of all the key capabilities needed for small-scale interventions, much less for the defense of Europe against a potentially large-scale threat from the Russian Federation. So we need to stay together and rebalance the alliance. That's where Trump has legitimate grievance with the other allies. And Macron should work on strengthening the European pillar of NATO rather than taking Europe in a totally separate direction.
Let me bring Pavel in and ask this question. Some of the headaches which Russia has had with NATO expansionism, would any of that be dealt with if we saw a different sort of common European defense arrangement? Would that deal with the placement of certain US missile systems, let's say in Poland and so on and so forth? Or ultimately, would we see the same sorts of military postures just with a different umbrella?
Well, those missiles that have been deployed in Romania and are being deployed in Poland, they're not under the NATO auspices. They are a kind of bilateral agreements between America and Romania, America and Poland. And so that doesn't mean that it's kind of NATO is, of course, an important vehicle, but it's not the entire thing. The NATO expansion has been seen in Moscow as a very dangerous move. Russia has opposed it all the time. A belief that the kind of weakening of the transatlantic link and creation of a Russia-European link has been seen in Moscow as the right thing to do. That would be good for Russia, good for Europe, and to get the Americans a bit out and the Russians a bit in. So yes, I mean, weakening of NATO is seen as basically positive. The argument that after the end of the Cold War, NATO should have been disbanded like the Warsaw Pact, there's an argument coming from Moscow for a long time. But on the practical level, again, for the Russian establishment, military intelligence, defense industry establishment, disappearance of a viable enemy in the West would be quite a disaster. And so they would not want to see that happen, and they, even if NATO gets weaker, they'll be puffing up NATO capability, as it was during the Cold War, when both sides deliberately exaggerated almost tenfold the real capabilities of each other on the military intelligence side. So you have to always separate what a nation really needs and what its military-industrial intelligence complex really wants.
What a nation really needs is an interesting question, because there's been plenty of occasions people can point to things in history and say, well, the US and European military alliance doesn't really need to be entirely reliant on NATO. European countries, for example, have joined forces with the US outside the alliance several times. France and the US informally cooperated in the early phases of the Vietnam War, for example. The 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq involved troops from the UK, Spain and Poland. And much more recently, last month, in fact, the UK joined a US-led maritime coalition in the Strait of Hormuz to protect shipping routes and oil supplies. John, when you look at historical things like that, does that not make some counter-argument to the suggestion you were making of US hegemony and say, well, there's plenty of times where the Europeans have reached out to the Americans in military operations too? It's not always, a one-way street.
I'm simply referring to the basic fact, which is that the American defense budget is, if I'm not mistaken, superior to the next 7 countries added together. In other words, superior to Russia plus China plus Britain plus France plus I don't know which other countries. We are in a situation of gigantic hegemony, and all this talk about a European pillar and greater European contribution is for the birds, because none of it can come anywhere close to what America is spending on its military.
But here's, let me make the
Pavel Felgenhauer,
bear with me, let me make the counter-argument. There would be those in Europe who would argue that the reason they need an alliance with a power with with a much greater budget is because they face, in their opinion, right or wrong, a threat further from the east from a country that also has a much bigger budget than the individual countries of Europe.
Well, it doesn't. If you're referring to Russia, it has a roughly similar budget, in fact, to France and Britain, a little higher, but not of the same order of magnitude as America. So I think my view, to answer your question, is that because NATO is in search, I mean, Pavel Felgenhauer talks about the Russian military-industrial complex. What about the American military-industrial complex? The American military budget is $800 billion a year. That's more than $2 billion a day. America practically runs on its military-industrial complex, far more so than a country like Russia does. So it may be that certain countries, as I said in my first answer, calculate that it's in their interest to ally with this hegemon, but that doesn't change the hegemonic nature of the relationship. And above all, because NATO is in search of a function, it creates tensions where tensions do not necessarily need to be. And in particular, it creates them with Russia. And Europe, as with the migrants from Libya, as from the instability from Syria, Europe is the theatre where these tensions are played out. Tensions which are a long way away from America.
Hang on there.
And indeed some distance from Russia.
Let's unpack some of that. NATO creates tensions. The alliance with the US creates tensions unnecessarily. Let me bring Alexander into that one.
No, I disagree with that, of course. Let's not forget what happened in 2014. NATO didn't start a war in Ukraine, against Ukraine, and change borders by force. Russia did that. And it wasn't even reacting to anything NATO had done. It was actually reacting to the Ukrainian people's desire to have a closer relationship with the European Union. President Yanukovych, before he fled the country, had taken Ukraine out of the running and said that they were no longer interested in NATO membership, and NATO said fine. Yet Russia couldn't accept closer ties with the European Union and created a crisis which ultimately led to its invading sovereign territory of Ukraine. So NATO didn't cause this problem. NATO's trying to help
coup
Ukraine,
supported by the Americans.
Right, I'm sure there's plenty we can go back and forth on this one. Unfortunately, I am being told we're running out of time. This show has gone much quicker than I anticipated. Let's thank our guests, though, at this point, John Lockland, Alexander Vershbau, and Pavel Felgehauer. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team here, for now, is goodbye.